Hello, Dr. Tadros. Thank you for being here today. I'm so excited to have this conversation with you, and I'm having this conversation in my new role as Associate Editor of International Journal of Systemic Therapy. And again, like we're so excited to have you here.
Thank you so much. I'm super excited.
Thank you. So I'm wondering if for the beginning you can tell us about your background and yourself and what led you to specialize in the study of incarceration and family systems.
Yeah. So I was always one of those kids that loved like law shows, like Law and Order Special Victims Unit, every law related show. Loved it. I actually just recently rewatched The Night of. It's on HBO Max. So yeah, shows like that. I think it's called For the People. I've watched twice. For the People. Yeah, it got canceled. I don't know why. But yeah, all of those shows, loved it. And then I did my Parks come an internship at incarcerated facilities in Newark, New Jersey.
Mhm.
So I did a parenting group. I facilitated family night, and then I also provided individual, couple, and family therapy services to the individuals incarcerated as well as their loved ones. And so I think all of that really fueled my research for the following, I don't know how many years since then, but I think what I really enjoyed was the fact that I've always loved, you know, the family systems types dynamics, like since my master's, but
Mhm.
the complicated nuances of looking at incarcerated relationships, it's just like complexities on top of complexities. And it was something that was really not done in our field.
Yeah, I can see that. So in parentheses, I'm also a huge fan of watching just TV shows and movies. And besides, I feel like that is very helpful just in our field in general. I always recommend that to my students because when you watch all these different things, it would help you to have more empathy for people and different contexts and different stories. So
Yeah.
huge fan of that. But tell us about your research and just incarceration in general. How does it impact families with that context?
Yeah. So I think what's really interesting to me personally is those that are left behind. And so in delving into the literature, there is a ton on children and the impacts of parental incarceration on children. I think it's because our society feels a lot more empathy towards children.
Mhm.
But if you are 43 and have an incarcerated brother, we don't seem to I think just the blunt word is care in our
Mhm.
society about the impacts that would have on the larger family system. And I
Mhm.
think even culture plays a huge role in that. For example, your role as a sibling will look very different depending on what culture that you derive from in your family of origin. And so we care a lot about how that impacts children, but not necessarily siblings, co-parents, sometimes romantic partners in literature, but also not that much unless
Mhm.
you are currently in a relationship with an incarcerated individual.
Mhm.
But if you just share a child with that person, no literature is really out there about the impacts.
That is very interesting. So, how do all these different family systems, for example, nuclear or extended, or even like you mentioned, family from different cultures, how do they respond to this matter when they face it? Do we see
Yeah,
a difference? Yeah.
I notice a lot of family dysfunction. So I think of like some structural principles that come into play. There needs to be a restructuring of the entire family system, especially if one key member of the family is removed. So in the nuclear family, like structural would talk about, the parents being at the top of the hierarchy, and then underneath would be the children and, the healthy family system that Mnuchin talked about. And so if one of the parents are incarcerated, how does that play out in terms
Mhm.
of reintegrating back later
Yeah.
because they've kind of lost that authoritative role. But then also does like the oldest sibling kind of move up in that hierarchy? What are the rules, boundaries that
Mm.
come into play? And then I also think about in terms of power, you're using a lot of that resources that you have, like, mostly when we think of money and time
Mhm.
resources, that one partner is utilizing a lot of those resources for the incarcerated individual. How does that kind of trickle down to the other members of the family, as well as the emotional impacts? I think just delving into and kind of like unraveling the different impacts, like physical, emotional types of impact, as well as like resources
Mm.
kind of are deprived by so many at the same time. And then all this is happening just kind of at once, especially if someone's getting arrested, and then everyone else in the family just kind of has to deal with that, and then
Mm.
their roles change in the family as well.
That makes sense. So, what are some of the common challenges that maybe children in families with incarceration would experience, or even like partners or family members? What are some of the common challenges that we talk about or we see in research?
Yeah, so a big one is distance traveling to facilities. So let's say, in our society, we care about keeping families together.
Mm.
That's like a lot of like, even what like Social Security Administration talks a lot about, like keeping families together. So just like our own societal values too, about like how we view family, and we want to keep them together. But what does together mean? Does that mean physically together? Because incarceration actually physically separates families.
Mhm.
So let's say you are trying to keep with that narrative of keeping families together and you are traveling to facilities. A lot of times, there's been a ton of studies done on like spatial distance. They're not very close to where families are residing. So you might be taking a lot of time and money to get there. So for example, like taking a bus or driving would be costly in terms of transportation. But a lot of facilities have very specific rules in terms of when you can visit and who can visit. So what you need to do is you need to plan your entire schedule, you and the other visitor. So let's
Mm.
say it's one partner visiting the other and their children. Taking everyone there can be costly, but as well as very time consuming in terms of like waiting at the facility, then having the visit and then traveling back and forth. All of that is very time consuming.
That is very interesting, which made me think about all these different structures and policies and different things that we have in society or in a nation, right? So, is there any sort of like change that we hope that it could happen that would help with this, with these all different challenges in families with incarceration?
Yeah, so I've written a little bit about this, and I think the COVID pandemic displayed a lot of the ability for telehealth. So
Mhm.
I do telehealth very sparingly before the pandemic because of how insurance would view that,
Mm.
but also how our society's comfort level has increased with using telehealth services, as well as online usage in general, especially with video usage. But I think that our visitations can be video and audio as well. And
Mm.
so there's some studies being done where they're studying like child visitation through online practices as well. But it's really about the policy. So it's not that I couldn't go into a facility and me and the incarcerated individual could be utilizing telehealth services with their family members and make it pretty easy and cost effective. It's that the facilities do not allow things like that. And
Mm.
then also, who is the stakeholder here? How are the facilities going to make money off something like that? How is the state and privatized prisons making money off that? Um, so although our health system could benefit from that, and the emotional health and psychological health of the individuals and their families could greatly benefit from that, it does not benefit, um, I guess, the financial needs of those in power.
Hmm, that is very interesting, which reminds me of just capitalism and all those different fun parts of our conversation. But so I'm thinking about all the different things that you have mentioned so far. And so let's say if I'm a student in couples and family therapy program, or even like I'm a therapist, and now I'm interested in working with this population. What are some of the things that I need to be mindful of? Or, in other words, like when you're training your students, if they are interested in working with this population or they happen to work with this population, what are some of the things that you think important for them to know?
So many. So a lot of these come up in either like podcasts I've done or random stories in class or like anecdotes that I've written for book chapters and blogs and things like that. But one I would think about is ethics. So our ethics are very different because you have, let's say you are a marriage family therapist and you follow like the AMFT ethical guidelines, but then there's also facility rules, right? And then your own kind of morals and values. So I kind of always tell this one story where well, I have two, I guess, two stories. But one would be where it was my first session ever and I was very ill prepared. I I know a lot of the programs do a very good job of having you watch sessions first and shadow and things like that. It's not really a thing in incarcerated settings. They're not really built for things like that. So I didn't know what I was doing at all in terms of how to navigate therapy in this kind of facility. And so we have our informed consent that you practice in school, and it's, you know, masters where you do your role plays and things like that. And so I had mastered the informed consent, but there's also a facilities rule kind of informed
Mhm.
consent, which basically in conjunction with our normal informed consent of our limits to confidentiality, we also had to have a form that said other rules and other limits. So one would be the limit to confidentiality about breaking facility rules. So I'll get to that story later. But the main part of this story would be that there was also like it was kind of like reading them their rights in a sense of it was telling her that she did not have to disclose a health concern to me.
Hmm.
And then it said such as, so like things that she would have had to talk to like maybe her nurse about, and like for her medications and the doctors there, she was HIV positive.
Mhm.
She disclosed this later on. But in session, she just started crying immediately when she saw the form. I'm thinking, this is my first session. I have no idea what, like, we're crying already. What did I do? Like, we didn't
Mhm.
even get over anything. And so basically she was, I don't know how I caught this on essentially, but she was trying to disclose something based on the form. And I was like, no, 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 you don't have to. And English was her second language. And I speak Spanish as well, but I was not comfortable doing therapy in English. So I definitely wasn't um, ready to do it in Spanish. And so I was just explaining to her, no, you do not have to disclose whatever you're going to me. If you want to, we can talk about it, but it's saying any health concern that you have, you do not have to tell me. You're not like legally obligated to do so. She felt relieved. And then like sessions later, she ended up going back to that and felt comfortable enough to tell
Mhm.
me about it. But there's different limits to confidentiality, and there's different rules in general when you're in these kind of facilities, and you remind yourself when you're working there that a lot of their power and rights have been kind of ceased or on pause. So even though that we talk about in a lot of, you know, my classes and in a lot of like AMFT literature, we talk about like the roles of power between like therapist and client, and your you know, your theoretical orientation maybe guides that. But you have even like kind of the division of power even is widened,
Yeah.
or yeah, I don't even know the right word for that, but you just have so much power. And so I guess 23-year-old me was reminded of how much power I truly had in that situation. And then another story about like in regards to ethics was in that informed consent, it does say that I have to report if somebody breaks a rule in the facility. So like, let's say somebody told me that they had smoked a cigarette,
Mhm.
which, you know, that is not illegal in terms of our general, you know, day to day. If somebody in private practice told me they smoked a cigarette, I would keep it
Mhm.
moving. I wouldn't really address that. However, in this context, they were saying that you would have to report that.
Hmm.
I did not report those types of things because I know what harm that does in terms of the relationship, and my ethics would say that I'm going to protect my client, because
Mhm.
that would have caused my client a lot of harm to tell a correction officer, hey, they smoked a cigarette, for example.
Mhm.
And so that also puts me in an ethical dilemma of, do I protect my job? Because let's say someone happened to find out that I was, you know, allowing this and not reporting bad behaviors,
Mhm.
right? Then I guess I can get fired. I mean, to me, like my ethical guidelines show that I don't need to do that. And there's limits to confidentiality, of course, but nobody's being harmed by this person sneaking a cigarette,
Mhm.
right? And so I did not disclose that. Most people did not disclose breaking rules to me. It was kind of hard to break rules anyway, but of course, uh,
Mhm.
you know, I'm sure that some of them were just smart enough to not tell me, right? But then others had this relationship with me where they felt they could and maybe forgot that
Mhm.
that was an informed consent, or didn't think about it once it came up in a story that they happened to break a rule by like sneaking food or something.
Mhm.
So I think about things like that in terms of ethics, that your ethics might be a little bit different based on facility, as well as your rules, as well as how therapy is being done. So, you know, beyond ethics, maybe just something logistical like, um, you know, I was able to see individuals a lot more in this type of facility
Mhm.
because they were housed there. So similarly to when I worked in a hospital in an inpatient unit. However, families are less likely to make a trip for an hour away for a therapy session versus in the community, they might not live an hour away from their therapist. It's kind of something that doesn't happen as often.
Mm.
Um, you also have to think about like, and when I worked in private practice, I could have all of these toys available. In an incarcerated setting, they didn't give me any toys.
Mm.
And I really couldn't just bring anything I wanted in. So I had to be really creative, and I made water bottles as people, I just drew on them. I am not a crafty and creative human in that realm. I could be crafty research wise. Um, in terms of like creativity and play therapy with children, which this is not an environment that's really hospitable to children. The walls were, just bland. I mean, like there was just nothing around to make it like hospitable for a child. And so, I would say like the floors were even dirty versus in like private practice where we could like sit on the floor together. Like it's just such a different environment that you have to be very creative in the way you did things. So we did a lot of like drawing because I could always get my hands on paper. Um, but like water bottle people just happened to be a thing. So I would say you'd have to be creative. And sometimes, I mean, you just have to work with what you have, even though we shouldn't have that, right? And it's more of a policy thing. Like, why aren't there like some kind of sanctions in place to make this more hospitable? I don't know.
Hmm. That is very interesting. I somehow feel like nervous when I think about all these different things that I probably don't know about working with this population.
Mhm.
And at
Mhm.
the same time, feel hopeful that there are people, amazing people and scholars and therapists like you that, if people they're interested or they want to get
Mhm.
education, supervision, they can reach out to you. So you
Mhm.
were talking about this whole dynamic, and one of the things that you mentioned was power dynamic, which was very interesting to me. And I'm thinking about, yes, there is, that highlighted part when you work with this population, right? And then that makes me think about self of the therapist, right? So probably that is a huge part of, your work, if you want to work with this population. And one
Mhm.
of the things that I remembered is not me, but one of my colleagues, one of my friends, when we were PhD students, she was working with this individual who came back from prison, and that person had kind of like he didn't have advanced educational journey. But what I remember was my friend told me, this is really interesting to me because it challenged my bias about insight. So if you asked me before that, what is insight, or what kind of clients has the most insight, right? Usually we have some sort of bias about education, socioeconomic status, blah, blah, blah. And then my friend told me that I'm working with this person and he's one of the most insightful people, clients that I've had in my life. And that this is really interesting for me. So just thinking about that, what are some of the experience or things that you have in mind to share about this power dynamic and also self of the therapist in working with this population?
So I think of just like biases we hold. But some of these biases are based on and just like stereotypes, they
Yes.
stem from something.
Mhm.
So a lot of like media out there talks about basically that incarcerated individuals are like big bad criminals. And in reality, a lot of the people, I did not work in maximum security. A lot of people that were incarcerated were for things like very few domestic violence, but nothing that was like murder or rape, kind of the bigger things
Mhm.
that people are incarcerated for. It was a lot of possession of drugs, like some things that were illegal when I was working these facilities are not anymore. Like weed was decriminalized and things like that. Um, so I think about these types of things and how we view crime. Um, and a lot of people I worked with were selling drugs so they could feed their families because they came from family backgrounds that were, would say, not what we would consider well off. So
Mhm.
I think about as MFTs, we very much understand how systems work. And so if you were given no resources and have come from a background full of trauma and lack of resources and lower income,
Mhm.
and then you start off with nothing kind of thing in terms of finances, and then you find yourself in a situation where you need to figure out how to feed your family. And I think of like Maslow's hierarchy of needs when I've taught like undergrads, like kind of family dynamics that connect to this. And so somebody would say like, oh, this is a drug user, you know, they're in jail. But I think about like drug use, like just because you sell does not mean you use. And a lot of people that were like in AA and NA and these types of groups, they were going to these groups for connection and they weren't even users of drugs or alcohol.
Hmm.
But it was because those were some of the few groups that were provided. Like I did a parenting group and that was another one of the few groups. And yeah, you did have to be a parent to be in that group, but technically you could say you utilized alcohol in your past or utilized drugs in ways that were harmful. And you could still be a part of this group. I mean, is there a way to prove that you used to use? I mean, like you could just be a part of this group and they were seeking connection and like other tools they could utilize. And I think about like the stigma it has attached to just like being incarcerated, but also the stigma of like having a partner incarcerated and how that plays out into our society. And so I think we need to be mindful of all of those things and how our own biases can keep that in check. Like I would say a lot of people actually used to ask me, are you scared? Because I was 23 working in these facilities. I also was doing my master's practicum there. So I had very little experience. Um,
Mhm.
you know, even when I was doing my internship, I still had very little experience. And I could say I've never felt unsafe. And there was like times where I was in a room with 10 incarcerated men with, I mean, one time I think I had a walkie-talkie, but like other than that, I had nothing on me. Not that I would be able to utilize any other
Mhm.
resource. Like people would ask me, like, do you have a gun? I'm like, what am I going to do with a gun? I'm providing therapy. Like, do you think people feel safe if I have a gun next to me?
Mhm.
And also this is an incarcerated facility. Like what? Or they would say, like, do you have you know, and they would like name different types of weapons. I'm like, again, what therapist would want to have any of these things? That's not for what we're doing. And then I also think that comes into play of like how we are, like you talked about power, we have this power, but they also see us in so much power. And I felt like I had very little power in terms of I have very little power to change this system. I'm following rules too. Like I couldn't even bring my phone inside. Um,
Mhm.
and so like if I'm seeing like 3 or 4 sessions, like you might want to put like I think in any other job I worked at between sessions, I would check my phone. I couldn't
Mhm.
do that. So
Yeah.
like I was under a lot of restrictions as well. Also, like, I don't even think I had access to a microwave. Not that I would eat there because I would always feel sympathy of like, you know, I'm eating like, you know, decently good food, even as a grad student. And there's people in here that were punished and like taking their food away and things like that.
Mhm.
So in terms of power, I had so much. So I didn't view it that way. And I
Mhm.
that there's like other aspects to that. Like, how can you provide good therapy if somebody is kind of scared of you too?
Yeah.
Because some people would think like I could tell on them, or like I remember somebody came in, they were kind of confusing me as like a probation officer in a sense of like they thought I had some power to like make arrangements and judgments and things. And I was like, I don't even know who you are. If I'm not even your therapist, and even if I was your therapist, I can't even. So there's just so many things that like I had no power over at all.
Mhm.
And then I
Mhm.
was also given like weird power of other things. Like I used to facilitate family night, but to be invited to family night, you had to already be approved on a visitors list.
Mhm.
I didn't know who was approved. It's not my job. I mean, I didn't do any security. If somebody came in and they were in family night, I was providing them the lecture, I was speaking to them, I was answering questions. So that is the job of someone else at kind of the door. And
Mhm.
so like I got a call from like, you know, the front, I don't know. And they were asking me that this incarcerated individual, he had a wife and a girlfriend, right? And as MFTs, we understand different relationships, different dynamics. They were asking me to decide he can't have both as a romantic partner. And then I think of like non-monogamy and other types of relationships. And they were saying he gets the wife or the girlfriend. Who do I want? I was like, wait a minute, me? I was like, I was like, I didn't even know he could have two listed because I don't look at their visitation list. They'll introduce me to whoever.
Mhm.
Sometimes somebody doesn't want me to meet someone. And again, I think about my ethics as a therapist. I'm not going to introduce myself. You might not want somebody in your family to know that I'm your individual therapist. So I had nothing to do with any of that, but they thought I had so much power, even like the correctional officers in the front, to decide girlfriend or wife who gets in. And so I just called that individual and I'm like, hey, did you know that you had them both listed? Apparently you can only have one come to family night. And he was kind of embarrassed because he didn't know that I was going to find that out. I was like, listen, I just need you to decide because one of them, I don't know who they are. They said
Mhm.
one of your female partners are at the door trying to get in, and you have to pick one to be off your visitation list. I don't want to be the bearer of any of that news. I don't want to decide those things. um Individual counseling, I could have those types of discussions about, what type of relationship they have, what's that going to look like post release, how that impacts the overarching family system. But in terms of this logistic, not my thing. And so I even had presumed power over things like that.
That is very interesting. You have so many interesting stories and experience, of course. So you were talking about biases, stigma, those kinds of things, and that makes me think of societal perceptions of incarceration in families, right? So how does it impact those families? And I'm also curious, do we have any sort of research that, for example, says in XYZ countries, because of better rules, policies, less stigma, so we have some sort of like it's correlated with improved well-being of this population. Do we have something like that? And what is just the impact of societal perception?
Yeah, so I'm actually not a scholar in what other countries are doing. I just know that there a lot of other countries are doing a better job.
Mhm.
Like they have less solitary confinement, which I've done some research on.
Mhm.
But I'm not an advocate for that. I'm not an advocate for the death penalty at all. I'm very against death penalty and I'm against solitary confinement. There's a ton of literature on the psychological impacts of solitary confinement. Just like if somebody wanted to torture me, put me in solitary confinement. I'm an extrovert. I need to be a social creature. I would I mean, I don't know for a fact, right? 'Cause it's never happened to me, but I don't think I would be strong enough to survive solitary confinement.
Mhm.
It is brutal. I'm not sure how so many people have been able to overcome that. There's a lot of literature that talks about how, people interviewed after were able to do that, like kind of like live in their
Mhm.
head a little bit. Um, I think it's very cruel and unusual punishment. And I know other countries do a better job of allowing for visitation, not have as lengthy sessions or sorry, sentences, things like that. Um, so I know that we are not doing a great job. Also, the US incarcerates more than every other country. So that's a whole
Mhm.
different issue about why. But also we have privatized prisons. So if people are making money, people are going to be inside. So people would say things like, we need to fill the beds. Um,
Mhm. Mhm.
in a jail, you wouldn't really hear that because people are in and out and circulating, but in a privatized prison, I mean, people are making money if they're in there.
Mhm.
So I worked for like privatized, and so they wanted people in there. Um, I think the societal bias is that you have to do something bad to be incarcerated, but I worked with some people that had parking tickets that were so I'm not a great driver and I have no business talking about parking tickets and traffic violations at all. But what I do know is that if you get apparently too many of them and then your license gets taken away, and you keep driving because you have bills to pay and you
Mhm.
obviously can't pay those parking tickets unless you go to work, but then you are caught driving to work,
Yeah.
you can be incarcerated. And so one thing I've talked about many times is how we don't necessarily view social support as a resource.
Mhm.
I have so many people in my life that would not let me sit in a jail or in a prison over $500 of fines. I am very lucky and privileged in my life where I know many people that would be making sure to get me and pay those parking tickets and we could deal with it later. But no, I mean, I don't have a situation where no one's going to come get me.
Mhm.
But I worked with she was in her 20s, a young female that so I don't always ask, but sometimes as the therapist, it comes up of why they're there. And she told me, and I just remember being like, okay, like, and what else? And so my stigma and bias, I guess, was that I didn't really realize how many people were incarcerated over what I would consider stupid. It was
Mhm.
stupid things like she didn't pay her tickets, she didn't have the income to do so, and then she was like, I'll take care of this later, and kind of let it get overdue and overdue and overdue. And they were finally like, until you could pay this off, we are going to incarcerate you. And she was just like, well, I can't pay it off.
Mhm. Mhm.
And so I was kind of like, my biases and what else? Like something else must have happened instead of our system is designed to keep poor people incarcerated, especially lower income individuals of color are
Mhm.
like the ones most targeted for the privatized prison system.
Mm.
And so she was in there and I was just like waiting for something else. And like a bias I had at like 23 when I first started doing that type of work was like, this is stupid. Like, why is she here?
Yeah.
Like, there's really no reason for this. And if anything, like, isn't there, like, I'm thinking more policy and macro about this, not just like her individual therapeutic needs, because she did have, there was something that was useful to her in her incarceration. According to her, she goes, I got therapy. I would have never been able to afford therapy,
Mm.
which is very interesting to me because you should not have to go to prison to get therapy. Like, that's just a healthcare concern that we could talk about another day.
Yeah.
But I think there's no better way to explain it other than like there has to be a system that's better than this. Like, why are we incarcerating someone because they couldn't pay for parking tickets and
Yeah.
traffic violations? I've been pulled over a bunch of times. I've had speeding tickets, but that would never happen to me because I have social capital and I have a lot of people that would come get me, and I'm fortunate. And she was saying that she did not have people in her life that were going to take her
Mhm.
out of that environment and pay those tickets for her. And we talked about social supports, but how do you analyze someone's social supports on kind of a more in-depth level if your basic need of just getting removed from this toxic, horrible environment is even happening?
Yeah. And I'm pretty sure that many of us never ever would think about, for example, the scenario that you just explained when we hear the word incarceration or prison, right? It's usually associated with, as you mentioned, like criminal activities or people who, like, some people say like they should be there, right? And we never think about all these different things, or even like different ways of having consequences for behaviors, right? Not that the behavior is right or wrong, but like different ways of having consequences for what happened.
What about community service type
Yeah.
efforts to pay off these tickets
Yeah.
or something that would, you know, providing her a job to pay off these tickets that were going to be useful to our society because her sitting in there is doing nothing. I mean, she, like I said, she did say therapy was very helpful to her, but I was very honest with her. I was like, this is not the way you should get therapy. Like, this is ridiculous. Like, you have
Yeah.
some, and maybe, somebody can challenge my belief on that, saying it's horrible to get parking tickets. Like, yes, she did say that she parked in places and did not care about the fine. She did say that she was very negligent on these things. But does that mean that she needs, I think she was in there for like weeks before even anybody was going to like defend her.
Yeah.
It was just ridiculous in my mind. And also I think of, let's say you have no empathy and don't care about these individuals. Don't you care about like the waste of resources of tax dollars too?
Yeah, exactly. And that, just for me personally, it's even like sadder when I think about US is the richest country in the world, right? And yeah, different ways that we can use that money and we don't. So moving forward with our questions or conversation, can you please share some of the key findings from your research working with this family or studying these families?
Yeah. So I do many different quantitative and qualitative studies. So I'd say for my qualitative studies, I've used a Facebook group, which is I think about 16,000 people of incarcerated loved ones. It was started by this one mother of an incarcerated son. She's just a phenomenal woman and was wanting to advocate and saying like, we all need support.
Mhm.
And so basically there's a support group for anyone with an incarcerated loved one. And so I interviewed individuals from this group and I kind of broke it down into what type of relationship you have and trying to use systems and those types of theories to understand what's happening for these individuals. And a big finding of mine was that we would think the stigma would be attached to the incarcerated individual, but if you say my brother's incarcerated, that stigma is attached to you as well. If you say my husband is incarcerated, that stigma is attached to you as well. And so a lot of people were experiencing these secondary stigmas. So like, for example, you might not want to be friends with someone if you find out that their wife is incarcerated. Like, oh, I don't need that drama in my life is something like people would say, or I don't need
Mm,
that type of relationship if that's what they're into and things like that, like the them and they and like the um I guess like the collateral consequences, but trickle down into like a family. I think of like a genogram. I've explained
mm,
this before, and I'm just thinking of it in my head of like, if you say my mom used to be incarcerated, then like you have opened the door to that stigma of like, well, how were you raised? Were
mm,
you given a good life? And like the biases that come into play with that. And then it coincides with like what we talked about in terms of like crime. People always want to know, what did your kid do? Or what did your spouse do? Or whatever it is. And I mean, the stigma is attached a lot to the crime. If you say, and there's been different interpretations of this. If you say, selling drugs, you're thinking Pablo Escobar, right?
mhm,
You're not thinking of just selling some Adderall pills so that your kids can eat.
mhm,
Um, and so a lot of the population that's incarcerated is actually in there for crimes that a lot of people would write not that big of a deal or that they have done before. Um, Especially if it's like something like petty theft or traffic violations or underage drinking, things like that, that most
mhm.
people don't get incarcerated for, but those that can't afford like a $500 retainer for a lawyer, they are incarcerated or held at least in a jail until they are, released. So I think a key finding would be stigma. I also found, which is really awesome, that in these support groups, participants were trying to advocate for whoever their loved one was. So and advocacy came in different forms. So like one way is like telling their stories, right? That's just one way. Another would be they provide resources to each other. So I think about a lot of things that you just wouldn't know if you never had someone incarcerated, like that you're not allowed to wear certain things. So even the facility I worked at, like people would come in for therapy. I don't have a rule, and I've worked in hospitals, school-based, private practice, clinical mental health, name a setting, I've done therapy there. And I don't tell people what to wear, but an incarcerated facility, I even had a dress code. Like I wasn't allowed to wear anything too tight. I wasn't allowed to like wear sandals, like if it shows your toes. I couldn't have like skinny jeans or like leggings, just like any anything that was considered too tight. I wasn't allowed to have a lot of makeup on, like ridiculous, right? And so the individuals that were visiting also had rules,
Mhm.
but I didn't necessarily tell them what to wear because I don't care what you wear to session, but those are facility rules, right? And so you wouldn't know that your first time visiting, that maybe like your shirt was a little bit too tight. And that's very subjective, right? Depending on who's analyzing this. And so people would post in the group things like, am I allowed to wear a dress? And it's like some people were like, yes, some people were like, no, or this state, yes, or this facility. And they were just providing resources and giving logistical information that facilities do not give you.
Hmm, that's interesting. I didn't know
Mhm.
that actually.
Yeah. So like if I worked multiple jobs at that time because this was my unpaid internship and practicum. So if I was in the summer, wearing like, an office dress to my like office job, I would have to change before I went to my other unpaid job.
Hmm.
So I'm thinking about people that have like uniforms or work in different fields where they would wear something that would not be allowed at these facilities. They would have to figure out taking the time and effort to change before visiting, or they can get turned away.
Yeah, yeah.
So
Hmm.
I think like things like that. And then my findings also really showcase the impacts on partners. So using a lot of actor partner independence modeling, looking at how the partner, like romantic partner or co-parenting partners, incarceration impacts other things in their partner's life, such as like depression and how you view your partner's parenting and anxiety and all of these different things like conflict resolution and relationship satisfaction, and how it's not linear and one impacts the other. And there's various physical and mental health concerns that coincide. And that's usually not surprising to people, right? That if you're incarcerated, your physical health may decline or that your mental health may decline, but your partner's physical and mental health can decline as well.
Yeah, yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
Mhm.
Especially like adding the context to it, like about the societal
Yeah.
perception and everything, and also, resources that people have and don't have, right? So, one of the last questions, I'm very curious about this question myself. So, throughout your career, what has been the most surprising or unexpected finding in your research or in your work with incarceration and the family systems?
I'm constantly surprised by things I find, but also not surprised. Like
Mm,
I'm gonna try to explain this as best I can. It's horrifying to find these negative findings, but they're expected. Like
mm,
incarceration doesn't have a lot of good that comes out of it. Like, so one of my findings, that was considered like a good finding, right, was that for co-parents, it sometimes strengthened their relationship. But I think about, well, because if you have a negative co-parenting relationship outside of incarceration, maybe the non-incarcerated co-parenting partner has that power that they didn't have before because
mm,
they're able to make like parenting decisions. So like they had like less arguments, and that might be helpful for the child to not see those things
mm,
or a tumultuous relationship. Usually not many good findings, but this one was in terms of like they had a better relationship with their co-parenting partner, but that could be because of power and all these other things. It could also be that like, you know, they got more into a routine of like who was going to make these decisions and how. And it's also very much manualized because, like this person can call you, but you have maybe a limited amount of time. So you have to maybe structure your discussion a little bit differently. Like we have to make this decision about our child. We have like 5 minutes on this phone call. What are we going to do? Versus like outside, you can use whatever time and resources you want to argue that out, instead of like have a productive discussion. So that's just some of my ideas. In terms of like impacts, most of them are pretty negative, and that's not surprising to me.
mhm,
I think what is surprising is that I think I started really doing this work in like 2015. And so now it's 2024. And in 9 years, there's still a ton of policies that I think are absolutely ridiculous and that we need to be doing stuff about. I think what's surprising still is that there's not many MFTs doing this work. So I do a lot of collaborations with sociology, criminology. I go to those conferences. The conversations look a little bit differently depending on who I'm speaking to in terms of like family science and social work and like what they're focusing on. But in terms of my people, my MFTs, I'm so confused why more of us aren't doing this. And I am not saying that we all should be, right? I'm not saying that everybody has to have the same research interest because we need people in all of these different areas and populations. But what we do need is some better training because even if you're not working in these facilities, you will likely have a client at some point that is maybe recently released and they need to reintegrate back into society, or they might have a partner or a loved one of some kind that is incarcerated and they need resources and support and, some type of expertise with this population. And the training is just so scarce.
mm, mm. That is very interesting that now you mentioned that. So when I think about, so I have both background in MFT and also medical family therapy.
Yeah.
So I actually learned more about this population in my medical family therapy background and not CFD MFT background. And now that you're talking about it, I'm thinking about, okay, how many, like, even like in our trainings or assignments or, programs, how many assignments or conversations we have about this population specifically, or, different systems, this system, right? And yeah, not many comes to mind. So that is something that we should work on, as you mentioned.
Yeah, I think other fields do a better job of that, but they're also not providing the therapy, right? And we already have so much to work on and provide. I think of like working in different programs. I worked in a counseling program. I'm now in an MFT program. And regardless if I was using like K-CREP principles or more co-MFT, we don't really focus on this, but I always think about like working with different populations. So maybe not exactly the incarcerated population, but looking at different populations and how MFTs can serve them. But I think even broader, like you're talking about medical family therapy, I do some collaborative healthcare work, and I think it's easier to see how a collaborative healthcare team would be helpful in this type of setting, but we don't really do that for other issues. So I think it is, like you said, more talked about in those realms. But that's because there are doctors and nurses and pharmacists and psychologists and social workers that are in incarcerated settings and are working within the criminal justice system. MFTs are usually not even invited to the conversation or the seat at the table at all.
Hmm. I'm thinking about, now that we're having this conversation, it would be interesting if one day we have a special issue in our journal about this population.
I would love that.
I'm going to have that suggestion for Dr. Edwards. Okay, great. Thank you so much. Any last word or comment or feeling or feedback or opinion?
Yeah, well, one, I'm very grateful to be here and to have this conversation with you. This is long overdue. And I also want to just send kind of, and I've done this before, like a personal invitation to any MFT that wants to work on this topic. I have graduate assistants, research assistants, and interns that are, working with me on these topics, but also collaborators and co-authors. Like, I don't have to mentor someone on this topic. We can collaborate on whatever somebody else is working on, because there's always intersections
Yes.
within this work. Incarcerated individuals consist of people from a diverse array of backgrounds, and a lot more individuals are impacted than we think.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing that. And I'm very hopeful about that invitation.
Yeah.
So thank you so much, Dr. Tadros, and I look forward to having maybe many more conversation with you in the future.
Yes. Thank you.
Of course.